Hey everybody, it's Matthew Rathbun with Cole Banker Elite in Fredericksburg, and I wanted to chat with you real quick about a forms change that just occurred. So the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors, which has a committee that represents multiple associations, brokers, agents, and attorneys who deal with real estate on a routine basis, get together once a month and go over forms. And over the years, and several years ago for those who practice, you remember that when it came to well and septic, the seller paid oftentimes for a termite guy or gal to go out, look at the field and say, yep, it looks okay. There was just a walkover inspection. A few years later, we then introduced a much more invasive inspection of maybe even unearthing the distribution box, and there were options for the buyer. And now we've had a new evolution, and all of those prior, the seller paid for it. And last July, we released or saw the release of a form for well and septic that gave the option for either buyer or seller to pay for and carry the liability of septic inspections. And shortly after releasing that, we realized, it was too hard to create language without loopholes that was relevant for either the buyer or the seller who may have chosen those inspections, and we needed to go with one or the other. And so in looking at the consistency of all the other forms that existed in our library, we realized the best we can do to keep alignment with Virginia's principle of caveat emptor, buyer beware, and to be similar to all other contingencies inspection, is to grant the buyer who wishes the right of discovery with consent of the seller the option of doing the septic, but it'll now be at their expense, just like the home inspection, just like radon, and just like blood-based paint if they wish it to. They can negotiate for the seller to pay for it, but by default the language will now cater to buyers are responsible for buyers' inspections. And yes, we do know that it's an added expense, and sometimes up to $600 or more for those septic inspections. But Nest gives the option for the buyer to choose what their risk is and what their expense is, and if they want something, they'll need to pay for it or negotiate for the seller to pay for it. If the buyer does choose to pay for it, they choose the septic inspection company. Therefore, if something is damaged or there's a problem with it, the buyer would carry the liability to bring it back to the standard. Or if there was a problem with it after the house was purchased, and maybe that problem was created by unearthing the box, the buyer would carry that liability, and the seller can now walk away, closing the transaction, having it remain as is, as the rest of the contract is, and then the buyer, if that distribution box or septic system was disturbed, would then have the responsibility of going back to the contractor that they hired and they take responsibility for to get an action to repair or give them money back in return, whatever the options are for them. So again, this is to reduce the liability of the seller, just like in any other inspection. It's to give the buyer some options, and again, we know that it may be an expense to the buyer, and buying a home is expensive. Buyers should account for that and decide on what their satisfaction is and where they have that level of need for, and if they can't afford it, then perhaps they negotiate the seller to pay for it, or they wait until they have saved a substantial enough amount of money to make a responsible choice, or they waive it. Those are their options, just like many other things we have in the contract. So that's a couple of the rationales. Again, this is an evolution, as forms always are. We find things, we learn new things, and this helps us to stay more in alignment with the experience or the theory of caveat emptor in Virginia and all of our forms. So if you do have any questions, reach out to the brokers, ask them how they would handle it, what they recommend, and stay tuned. I'm sure there'll be more training from some of the attorneys in our area and information coming out as we go along. So again, you have plenty of options. You can negotiate it, you can waive it, buyer can take that responsibility. Those choices are theirs. Thanks so much for listening. Have a nice day.